For those of you who don't know me, I am um, the Fox. I am the president of Rehumanize International. I'm just going to take a quick minute to introduce the speaker, and then I will get out of here and give her the rest of the session. Um, so the speaker for this session is Leah Sargeant. She runs Other Feminisms, otherfeminisms.com, a Substack community that focuses on the dignity of dependence. She is the 23-24 Wollstonecraft Fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute and the author of Arriving at a Med, author of Arriving at a Med and Building the Benedict Opinion. Building the Benedict option. So I will let her come on screen now, and I am so excited for this session and all the great talk that she has for us. So, Leah, the session is yours whenever you're ready.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here with Rehumanize. I'm here to speak about on a talk, No One is Alone, Rebuking the Lie of Autonomy. And what I want to talk about here is something where my perspective has really changed as I've engaged in advocacy and as I've had my mind changed by other people. So I think one thing that's tricky is that when we advocate for the weak, it's easy to accidentally wind up apologizing for their weakness. I think I've heard a lot of pro-life pitches that are all about how close the baby is to being a person. Your baby has fingernails. Your baby can hear as of this week. Your baby can differentiate between light and dark. And isn't that enough, to make them a person? Which always raises that lingering question of, what about the babies who don't hear, the babies who don't see? And it always feels like you're just trying to make sure that the person you're talking to is willing to kind of round someone up, that they don't quite feel like a person, but if we find enough person-like traits, then maybe we can kind of let them in early. You see this also in kind of the exceptionalism model of advocacy for the disabled, where you argue that people with Down syndrome have dignity because this woman with Down syndrome swam the English Channel. And I understand the temptation to highlight the exceptional, to remind folks about the assumptions they've made, that they find, the idea of functioning, accomplishment, happiness so incomprehensible, you have to put up a stark example to grab their attention. But again, this kind of raises the question of you're already arguing according to the logic of your opponent, that there has to be something exceptional about a person to let them be a person. And if you can't find that piece of evidence or that accomplishment, then maybe they're not a person at all. I think one of the saddest examples I saw was one on This American Life, which was just talking about the family of a man who had become very old and had a little bit of cognitive decline and dementia. And they would show up to his doctor's appointments, not just with a list of his medical charts to make sure no one forgot anything, but they'd show up with clippings of things he wrote, articles about him, because they felt like to talk to his doctors, they had to show up with evidence that their father was a person. And that evidence all had to be about his life before decline. Because when their doctors looked at their father, they didn't trust and had reason not to trust that their doctors didn't see a person. So they were constantly beginning appointments that might be about adjusting medication, planning for pain, not with those medical questions, but with that philosophical question of, have we found enough evidence that our father used to be a person so that we can all agree we're going to continue to treat him like a person now? And I think there's no wonder why people kind of fall into this rhetorical strategy. First of all, it can make a real difference for the person you're advocating for with an unsympathetic or, blinkered audience. And especially when the stakes are high and you're advocating for an individual, you want to make enough progress for the person to see them accurately as a person, even if it's not on the best grounds. And I think it's just that, we live in a culture that distrusts weakness. So, especially at the beginning and the end of life, children in the womb and the elderly are marked by profound need. And because of that, they face a double vulnerability. First, they have an urgent physical need for care, but then the fact of their need puts them in danger not just of neglect, but of active harm. Because when people are marked by visible need at the beginning of the life, at the end of life, and increasingly in the middle, our culture increasingly says that their need makes them licit target for violence, the killings of abortion and euthanasia. So to push back against that assumption in the culture, that need makes us doubly vulnerable, the fact of the need and then the undoing of our personhood once our need is visible. I want to just highlight two powerful counterexamples and counter witnesses I've seen of people who refuse to compromise on the dignity of the person, full stop, without having to analogize someone who is weaker, older, younger, disabled by saying, don't worry, they're almost like a real person. So please try and bridge the gap there. The Dominican Sisters of Hawthorne care for the indigent poor. So they take in folks who have terminal cancer, who can't afford to pay easily for ordinary treatment, who often wind up kind of stranded in long-term nursing care, but without the proper palliative care they need. And they take them into their home, they live with them, they pray with them, and they tend them until the end of their life. And because of the experiences they've had in other hospitals and with other doctors, when their families bring them to the sisters, they're usually doing exactly what that family was doing for their father. They come with evidence that their parent, grandparent, cousin, brother is worthy of love. And all that evidence is about who they were before their pain was so intense, before they lost control of a bodily organ, before they were poor. And the sisters are happy to hear it, because if anything gives their family comfort in telling these stories, remembering their times, they're glad to be witnesses to it. But they're very clear that they're here to love the person in front of them and that they never met this person in their prior life or their prior strengths, and they don't need to know anything about that to love them specifically as they are right now. And they think their work would be impossible if it relied on kind of a qualification process of people's prior life, pre-cancer life, to know and love them. They simply know that this person bears the face of Christ. This person is in pain. This person needs human accompaniment to prepare for death. And nothing about that is surprising to them because their whole life revolves around those needs. The other one that I found really arresting came in O. Carter Snead's What It Means to Be Human, which is the year it came out is my favorite book I read that year. And it's this wonderful blend of legal history, advocacy, and kind of philosophizing. And again, like I said, a lot of the pro-life arguments I'd heard, including the pro-life arguments I'd heard when I was myself previously pro-choice, were about, it sounded like, rounding up the baby. By this number of weeks, the baby is pretty much a person. Once this baby has a capacity, it's sort of like you. And in his book, O. Carter Snead makes almost the opposite argument. He says the baby has a profound moral claim on its mother by virtue of its need, and by virtue of the fact the mother is the only one who can meet certain needs of the baby. He doesn't feel the need to, point to any capacity or future potential of the baby, to just say, the baby is in need, only the mother can answer that need. But then he says that by virtue of that need, the baby, weak as it is, enfeebles the mother. It's everyone who has had a baby will know the need of the baby makes the mother weak in answering it, whether that's through pregnancy nausea or exhaustion or complications after delivery. Ultimately, to be with the baby, the mother shares in the baby's weakness. And he says then the mother, like the baby, has a just claim on the people around her, again, purely by virtue of her neediness. Her claim is often more difficult to have answered because the baby knows exactly who it needs things from. Only the mother can give it blood. Only the mother can give it calcium. But because the mother's need can be answered by a number of people, it's more attenuated and therefore easier for the people around the mother to duck, because everyone knows they could individually walk away or say no without guaranteeing that she's left adrift. And therefore, each individual person may find it easier to cast off responsibility. And as they all do, she's left as vulnerable and abject as the baby would be. But what I was so struck by reading Carter's argument is I'd so rarely seen someone say, look, not just the baby is like the mother, the baby is almost the mother, just saying the mother is the baby, and the mother is like the baby and is a person because she's weak and because she's dependent. And of course, there's a word for analogizing a full-grown human woman to a baby, and the word is infantilizing. It's a word that is immediately taken as pejorative. If we analogize a grown person to a baby, we must be saying that grown person is in some sense not a person. Because even when we're off the topic of abortion, to some degree, our culture doesn't believe the baby is a person. So to compare an adult to a baby is insulting, which is untrue. It not only stifles our discussion about abortion and how to respond to need, but it takes a lot away from our ability just to recognize the good things that exist in a baby that we want to participate in our whole life. When I admire someone for their delight in the world or shamelessness in enjoying the world, they're often more like a baby than what we think of as an adult, mature person. And I'm infantilizing them to say, I delight in their joy. When I see someone who's unashamed of struggling in the way that no baby is ashamed of trying to sit up and falling down, but adults are ashamed over and over to pick up a new skill, to try and care for someone in a way that's new for them because they won't do it perfectly the first time. And if I run into an adult who is unashamed to struggle, to explore the edge of their mastery the way a child does, and I say, I love how childish that person is. I've seen her fail so many times and not give up. I've insulted her, because to compare her to a child is insulting because we don't believe in the humanity or the goodness of the child. And I think kind of the best answer to this, and something that Richard John Newhouse includes in his book, Death on a Friday Afternoon, when he says, it has always struck me as puzzling that some people say that an embryo or a fetus does not look like a human being. That is exactly what a human being looks like when it is 2 weeks old or 2 months old. It is what you look like and what I looked like. I think there are so many times in the culture where we talk about an ordinary part of human life. Most starkly when we talk about children before they are born, but often when we talk about the elderly and we say, well, he's just declined so much mentally. That's not a human life anymore. He's in a lot of pain and that's not a human life anymore. She's struggling with mental illness and now that's not a human life. But this is what it looks like to look human as you die, as your cognitive faculties decline, as you struggle with mental illness. There's no other way to picture it. And I love how Newhouse puts that. If you say, okay, this baby doesn't look human to me at 2 weeks, you go, okay, well, what would, a 2 weeks past conception human being look like if not this baby? What would count as human? What would a terminal cancer patient who really looked human look like in their last day before death? And when you start to think of it that way, if you almost picture the whole patchwork quilt of life, the different moments you have, moments of strength, moments of illness, moments of severe dependency, moments of being able to help others, whether or not you do. And you start to picture taking a sensor scissor to that great, that great lineup, that sequence of your life, and saying, well, these bits don't really look human, these pre-birth bits, and this bit near the end doesn't look human, and you had the flu and it was very gross and it doesn't really look human. I just don't picture a human throwing up, so that part comes out. And you start to notice that if you look at a human life and you take out everything that doesn't look human in that way, everything marked by profound need, by just intense bodiliness, there's very little left. You've got almost this spider web, right? You've got more gaps than you have substance. And that's the culture we've built up, a culture that takes this idea of autonomy, of strength, of peak physical and mental performance, which none of us inhabit except for a very short, interruptible period of our life, and say, that's when you're human. And because you can occasionally hit those peaks we're prepared to ignore the troughs most of the time, unless you'd like us not to, and then we're happy to put you to death through euthanasia. But most of the time, as long as you can hit the peaks occasionally, if you can be human, I don't know, 15% of the time, 20% of the time, we'll write the rest off as a rounding error. And you wind up with this culture where we take, this narrow, brief experience of humanness as the pattern for our whole lives. And that means everyone constantly fails at being human and is racked by guilt at failing to live up to a standard that it seems like at least someone around you is occasionally meeting. And ultimately, when we have a culture that starts with a fundamental misconception of what it means to be human, we can only get so far on kind of trying to find the brief peaks in someone else's vulnerable life to say, this person with a disability has hit the peak often enough that we have to count them. This person who's very old previously hit a couple of those peaks, so we should still count them. And the reason is it's impossible to build a just society on the foundation of a false anthropology. Our culture asks us to participate in a lie that mature humans don't need each other. It cuts everyone with severe, profound needs right out of the human family. But at that lower level where it feels like you're close enough to the peaks enough of the time, maybe you're an able-bodied, unattached man in your late 20s, early 30s, the peak human specimen, it teaches you to be ashamed of everything that doesn't feel like strength or feels like it might be neediness. Even the simple neediness of, I'd like to see my friends more often, starts to look like a embarrassing lack of autonomy. And you wind up with this situation where even kind of the strongest people in this conception don't buy anything by virtue of their strongness. You can kind of almost never trade your strength points in for being able to show need, because we've so firmly taught everyone that need is disgusting, that need is untrustworthy, and that if you need too often or too badly, you might slip out of the category of human altogether. And so I think especially in this era, when in America we're having more and more conversations about abortion in the context of Dobbs, and there's a real temptation to look for a reasonable compromise of just advocating for the babies who look most like babies. Surely we can all agree, I think the most popular pitch has been a 15-week ban. Those babies who have elbow joints, just like you, we can agree we can advocate for those babies. That we can't get very far. You might win a few brief tactical conversations if it lets you save a life with a friend you're talking to who's abortion minded, but on the fence. I'm not going to say don't use those arguments, but you can't possibly win the war by finding small capacities of humans to argue justify their humanity, rather than simply arguing that humans are humans and we don't lose that during our periods of need. Someone who went through their whole life unmarked by need would be genuinely the person we could not recognize as human. Think what their body would look like. Think what their life would look like to be born needlessly, with no need, with no connection from their very first days. That's what we would actually find alien and shocking. So I think, on the context of abortion, and especially in the context of euthanasia, which is kind of an ongoing low simmer fight in the US and a full-blown conflagration in Canada and in Western Europe. In Canada, where they're ready to put children to death for depression. In Western Europe, where they're putting people with autism to death who are in their 20s because they have autism and because it isn't curable. We have to really make the point that it's not that we found exceptional humans who are needy some of the time, but occasionally very impressive, but that need is what makes us human. Refusing to apologize for need or be ashamed of it. And by so doing, we're not just advocating for the most vulnerable among us, we're also talking to the people who seem to occupy a position of strength, but have that same tattered life that anyone else does if you judge by that standard. And during their periods of need, even mild need, don't know how to ask because they're afraid of what it means to admit neediness. So on the very practical level, I want to give everyone a little homework for the coming week. And it's just to ask for help for something in the next week. Because I think, honestly, one of the best ways to testify to the dignity of neediness is not just to make the argument, though I'm making it here. And I think it can be arresting, as it was when Carter Snead made it for me in his book. But it's to be unashamed of asking. Because I often find that it's when I ask for something from someone else that it turns out I've given them permission to ask from me. Sometimes that's a very small ask for me, or what feels like a small ask. I try when I'm with a Christian friend not to part except by saying, without saying, is there anything I can pray for you? And I ask them to pray for something for me. And it's funny how often I'll spend an hour or 2 hours with a friend and we'll have talked about a lot of things in our lives. And I won't have heard the most important thing going on in their life until I ask them to pray for me and ask if there's anything I can pray for them. But you can also ask for material things, immediate things. And I'm going to do this, I promise. So I'll tell you the thing I'm asking for. I've had a very eventful week. I had an exciting ER stay earlier this week and a staph infection. I've had a lot of help from people in my community who dropped off my kids, picked them up when I couldn't get home in time to, came not only to help me in my neediness, and then my kids who depend on me and I couldn't meet their need and then were exposed in their neediness and people came to help them, but helped my husband who then was suddenly working overtime to meet all those needs in our family. And just like the pregnant mother, became weak by virtue of my weakness and how he ran to answer it. And so the thing I'm going to do, I promise to do it today sometime after this talk, I'm going to ask one of my friends if she would invite us over for dinner this week, because we've been doing a lot of takeout in the midst of this. And I realize I keep thinking I'll ask people over again when I'm feeling stronger and when I'm healed. And that's again kind of thinking of that. I have to wait until I can give before I can receive. So the more that you testify in your own life and in your own friendships that need is not embarrassing and that it's a sign of your friendship that you ask, I think the more you'll be surprised by how much neediness is around you and how little hope people have it could be met. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm happy to answer some questions. All right, I see questions in the chat, so I think I'll just take a swing at a couple of these. Let's see, I'll read them out and then see how many I can get to. I know there's a break coming up, but I also know that breaks are genuinely good, so I don't want to eat into your break too much. All right, so Ben Conroy asks, is calling autonomy a lie too strong? It seems as though something like autonomy or freedom or self-direction is a good part of life, not the whole thing or the most important thing, but a good thing nonetheless. For some people with certain moderate disabilities, part of what meeting their needs look like is helping them be self-directed in certain ways. How should we navigate this tension? I think that's a great question. I would say, more than autonomy, which I think really in its roots and in its practice carries this idea of aloneness. I like a lot the model from Montessori of just thinking about what's this interaction between this person and their environment and the circle around them, and how does it let them fruitfully struggle with things. And I think that's part of what we do, not as often as we should, make room for children that we don't for adults. The idea that part of being a person is working at the edge of your mastery, trying things, taking chances, thinking it's worthwhile to do something yourself, not because it gives you dignity to do or because you'd lack dignity if you couldn't achieve it, but because that encounter with the challenge enlivens your life and changes you by struggling, even if you don't succeed. So that's more what I want for people. That's a great question. It's not autonomy, but the sense of everyone deserves to work near the edge of what they can do and explore that. And when I won't use the word infantilize because I talked about why I don't like that, but when we see people with profound disabilities and kind of cut back or make their life smaller so that there's no struggle, nothing that they do that's hard for them or hard for people around them, we're taking away that real encounter with the world more than that we're taking away autonomy. All right, there's several Irish people here, so I'm going to do my best, but I'm actually not very good at Gaelic pronunciation. So Maureen Lynch, feel free to put a phonetic one in the chat so I can try a better pronunciation of your name in a moment. Says there's a fine line between acknowledging the frailty that comes with pregnancy and motherhood and straight into the territory of pathologizing pregnancy, which plays a big role in stoking demand for abortion. How should we navigate this tension? And that's a great question. I'll give an example of something I think is a good way of navigating it and something that kind of, really strikes at the relationship between mother and child. One thing I really never like in pro-life advocacy, and I try and avoid myself, is minimizing the demands of pregnancy. It's untrue. People know it's untrue right at the outset, so you can't get very far with it. And I think it's, relatively easy to support that all pregnancies are risky for women. They're not so risky that it's, a wild risk to take or an imprudent risk to take. But one thing I thought when I was pregnant, both a time when I was losing a baby and a time when I was successfully delivering a baby, is, this is unusually for me the period of my life where if I died in the next week or two, I would be able to guess what I'd die of. Versus I think normally my guess would have to be hit by a car, right? I'm a young, relatively healthy woman. And just that shift from I'm going about my ordinary life where nothing is profoundly risky except cars, to now there's this new risk that not everyone around me is subject to, is a real shift. So I think that's important to acknowledge and not to minimize. But where I see that go into pathology, and I like, pointing that out, is when you take, just the relationality between the mother and child and recast it as warfare. I've seen this in the big book, Making the Case. I'm trying to remember the title of it. Someone I'm sure will remember in the chat. The Full Surrogacy Now. That's the book, where it's making the case against natural pregnancy, natural families, and it gives this like intense metal narration of placental formation, and it's like, the baby's spiral-shaped blood vessels burrow into the mother, taking from her, ripping out. There's no moment where you think you can have this much blood, but no more. It's just demand. It's not totally biologically accurate. It's not actually the case that the baby just hoovers out whatever they want from the mother. From pregnancy all through parenthood, part of what the mother does is shape the child's growth through no's. In pregnancy, they're not active, conscious, chosen no's, but the body does not actually let the baby grow without restraint and without direction. But you also just see, kind of, you can narrate this in two ways. And one is this rapacious warfare that the baby is waging on the mother. And the other is the receptivity of the mother, who lays herself open, vulnerable to another's need. And that there's still a lot of blood and a lot of drama to that. But you're much closer to something like the story of Mary's Fiat, or even, the stories of people who welcomed in refugees to their home, who made themselves vulnerable, who made themselves exposed, who saw less of a barrier between them and the world and them and the other than we usually see. And see that not even as aberrational, but as closer to the way we want to live in relationship to others. So we don't take baby and mother dyad as this weird thing, but as this salutary example for how we can relate to others. All right, and I think I'll do one more question because we're coming out of time. And I'm not picking the one, Elizabeth Jennings, that's the story of how you became pro-life, because it's longer or complicated. So I just would never you would have no break with that one. But do I have a canned response or a more lengthy one to the pro-choice argument that bodily autonomy is absolute? Many pro-choice or abortion activists now say forthrightly that a pregnant person, or say conjoined twins, can choose to remove the dependent person by any means necessary. How can we respond to that kind of argumentation? Thank you for that question. Part of how I think of it is that it's just at baseline not true. It's not true about our bodies. It's not true about our property. It's not true about our time. And it's easier to say it about our bodies because, first of all, it's harder to have things taken from our bodies. But I think of the example of the quote from St. Basil the Great, that, the extra coat in your closet belongs to the man who has none. There's a great deal I possess beyond just my body that I don't have an absolute claim to, that I'm a steward of my possessions, not the total owner of them. I have no right to destroy something functional just for the pleasure of destroying it. I have no total right to my body. I have no total right to my talents or skills. I have no total right to my time. I made none of these things. I earned none of these things. All of this is a gift. I may have worked as a steward to develop my talents, to safeguard my body, to take care of my possessions, but none of these things are mine. They were all given to me to take care of and to respect according to their natures. And none of these things can I withhold fully from others in need. So that's my brief answer. And I think depending on who I'm talking to, I might kind of drill in on a particular part of the world where they think this is true, right? Like whether there's someone who is pro-abortion access, but also very pro the rights of homeless people to shelter where they don't own the property, right? Like pro-abortion access, but also think someone should licitly be able to steal medicine when they can't afford it, and say, these are along those lines. Each of us possesses less than we think, but we're given the enormous power of stewarding the gifts we have received unearned. Thank you so much. I hope you guys enjoy your next break and the rest of your time with all the speakers here with Rehumanize.